In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Today in the Gospel, we see this problem that many of us have. This problem of assuming. We assume things. We assume things oftentimes based on what we would deem to be reasonably so, right information. The information of our tradition that we were raised in, the information of our culture, the information of our own, let's say, opinion. And so based on these things which are seemingly empirical, based upon these things which seem factual, we make assumptions. The problem with assumptions, as many of you have heard, is that they do something. And those of you who chuckled know exactly what making an assumption does. You see, everyone's making assumptions in this gospel. Everyone except the Lord. The disciples are making an assumption. Why is this man blind, Lord? Whose sin was it? His or his parents? So this first assumption begins this whole series of events. What does Jesus say? He says it's neither the man nor the parents, but rather for the work of God. And so we begin to see how the Lord takes this opportunity to dispel this unfortunate tendency that humans have, which is to assume. We must understand that assumption is in many ways, us playing God. This judgment. We assume that something is, and so we operate based upon that. We speak based upon that. And so oftentimes, God has to come, and he has to do the cleaning up, if you will, of this mess that we make when we have assumptions. Now, some of the fathers will say that when the Lord bowed down and spat into the ground and made clay, and actually he made eyeballs for the man. Not just salve, but actually made the man eyeballs. And this may sound shocking to some of you. I saw some expressions in the crowd. What? But the thing is, if you remember that man is clay. Man is nothing but clay, especially to God. And so this is pertinent because Christ is showing himself to be God here. He's showing himself to touch this man, if you will, almost, if I could stretch, another little Adam, if you will. He's trying to give him sight. But the sight that he's giving him isn't just visible sight, new eyeballs. He's trying to give him spiritual sight. And he's, most importantly, dispelling the blindness of his disciples. Because as his disciples, all of us here, we have to ask ourselves, are we still operating as our forefathers, the original apostles and disciples do? Do we make these assumptions? Do we look at our circumstances? Do we look at people in our lives and we just say, yep, they sinned. Yep, God is doing this. Yep, God is doing that. And when we begin to do that, we begin to put ourselves in the place of God. And when we put ourselves in the place of God, Christ now has to take time and to correct things. And sometimes he has to come and reform us, reshape us. It isn't just enough for God sometimes to just kind of put a Band-Aid over the situation. Sometimes he has to give us a whole new set of eyes to see. The blind man, he became a new man, not just because he could see. I want you to pay attention to this. His parents were cowards. Do you see this? The blind man's parents were cowards. The gospel says so. The Pharisees came and said, is this your son? What's going on? And they're like, yeah, he's our son. He can answer for himself, but we don't really want to get cast out of the synagogue. This is what the gospel says. It says they said that because they feared the Jews, because they feared being cast out of the synagogues. Their vainglory, they cared more, like the rest of the Jews, about how they were being perceived and what they looked like versus what God was saying, versus the truth of God. And so his parents were cowards. His parents were vain people. His parents had this veil of religion. And God changes him. How do you know? Because he's brought before the Pharisees twice. And then that last time, do you notice the boldness in which he speaks? The boldness in which he says, "What is this? You're the teachers of Israel? When do you know of a man who has ever opened the eyes of another man? And you can't tell whether he's a sinner or not?" The boldness of the man. God opens his eyes, and so he's no longer blinded by his family tradition. He's no longer blinded by his culture. He's no longer blinded by his own circumstances. People his whole life, I'm sure, were telling him, "You're a sinner, your mom and dad were sinners," because that was the cultural understanding. But God gives him new eyes to see. And he sees that what man thinks God is doing is actually not the case at all. But rather, God is doing something very different with him. And in fact, with his whole nation, if they would just have eyes to see. My sons and my daughters, when God opens your eyes, when God gives you new eyes to see, your response should be one of gratitude. But that gratitude comes with a boldness. Because you're no longer just hinging things upon the opinion of the people around you, of your mom, your dad. Now you're rooted in truth. When you can see, and trust me, when Christ shows up, everything is clear. This is why when you see holy people, and when you read someone who knows God versus someone who thinks about God, who studies God, that sense of authority, that authority comes from seeing and knowing God. There is nothing hidden when Christ shows up. And so this blind man no longer had to hide behind the vanity of his parents, the vanity of his culture. He saw God. And in that he had a boldness. And he saw that his life was so much more than something that everyone had been telling him his whole life. So I ask you, when God gives you eyes to see, what are you seeing? How are you looking? Are you choosing to stay blind? Or are you moving out and you're having this boldness that comes from being with Christ and knowing that Christ touched you, has changed you, and that you see things differently? God desires that none of his children would be blind. Ask him. Not only will he open your eyes, but he'll give you new eyes to see. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.